Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening, and welcome to the first debate program of this year's edition of the Belgrade Poetry and Book Festival, Snap Up Poetry, which is being organized by Treći Trg and Srebrno Drvo, publishing houses from Belgrade, Serbia. So this year's edition of the festival is the 14th consecutive one, and the festival is being organized online for the first time this year due to the circumstances we all know everything about. So the coronavirus outbreak and the pandemic, which lasts for almost a year now, didn't prevent us to open up the space for all poetry and literature lovers once again, and to give them a chance to meet some of the finest poets and artists in Europe and our region also. Like every year, within the program of the festival, we are paying an homage to one poet we feel made a significant contribution, even for contemporary production and as well for the history of domestic literature. And for this year's edition, that's Rade Drajnac, a Serbian and Yugoslav surrealist. Drajnac also gave us the slogan of our festival, and that is bandit or poet, according to one of his poems. So this slogan will also be in the focus during this panel or discussion. Actually, everything will be focused around the position of poets and artists in contemporary societies, as well as some new spaces of poetry that might be emerging nowadays. Before we start, I would just like to walk you through the next 3 days of the festival. So in the next 3 days, you will get a chance to watch and listen to 45 participants, poets from 11 countries within our usual reading programs, which will be starting every night at 9 p.m., starting this evening. And also the debates such as this one that will be held every night from 7 p.m. until roughly 8:30 or maybe a little longer. So next to that, we will also have separate interviews with all the poets that are participating in this year's festival. And those conversations will be broadcasted through our Facebook and YouTube pages in the following days. Okay, I think I said everything that I'm supposed to say. It's a great pleasure of mine to open up this year's program and to talk with all of our guests that you can see in these windows now. My name is Ognjen Aksentijević, and I'm one of the authors and editors in Treći Trg. And next to me, this program will be moderated by Uroš Kotlajić, my colleague, also one of the poets and editors in Treći Trg, which was being published in the previous years. So Uroš, I will now let you speak a bit.
Thank you. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guests. From Norway, we have a poet, Torgeir Rebolledo Pedersen. Mr. Pedersen, good evening. Hello.
Good evening. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, thank you.
From Austria, we have a poet and a composer and writer, Sophie Reyer. Sophie, hello.
Good night. Nice to see you.
From Serbia, we have Ivana Maksić, poet and translator. Ivana, hello.
Hello, good evening.
From Slovenia, our guest tonight is poet and playwright Boris A. Novak. Mr. Novak, good evening.
Good evening, dobro večer. I was muted, sorry.
Dobro večer. From Romania and United Kingdom, we have a writer, Ioana Morpurgo. Ioana, good evening.
Nice to meet you all.
Also with us this evening is Catalan poet Xevi Pujol Molist. Xevi, hello, good evening.
Hi, good evening, everyone.
From Croatia, we have Aida Bagic, poet and writer. Aida, good evening.
Hi, everybody.
Also with us this evening is Macedonian poet and translator Nikola Magirov. Nikola, good evening.
Good evening, dobro večer svima.
And from Poland, Tadeusz Dąbrowski, a poet and director of the festival and so on. Tadeusz, good evening.
Hello, good evening. Hi.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Uroš. So without further ado, I'm very sorry for not being able to welcome you in Belgrade, but as Tadeusz said in the beginning, it's nice to meet you all. So to start with this conversation, I would like to pose my first questions to Mr. Pedersen. Torgeir, we can say without any doubt that you have a really rich career behind you. So 15 poetry collections, if I'm not mistaken, and a lot of other projects, artistic projects that you participated in as a performer or various kinds of associate. So would you be maybe able to reflect on the role of an artist in the past and the present society, since I suppose you can maybe make a parallel between the beginning of your career and the situation nowadays, of course, regarding the topic that we mentioned in the beginning.
Yes, the question about being a poet and a bandit, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. You know, I made some answers on the several questions here. So I'm originally educated as an architect, but 10 years after I have been working as an architect, I was put on another road, at the road, and that road is very familiar to me. That's maybe also why I have a grandfather who was a poet once in Mexico, that I'm very proud of following in his footsteps. But I'm a very different poet than him. He was functioning 100 years before me. He was born in 1877 and died in 1929. So I was born 10 years after him. But I'm a kind of metaphoric poet that that you can say that I'm a kind of an activist poet. I've also been member of an activist group of poets in the 80s that were called the Stunt Poets. And because we were very interested in making poetry broader, to make it a broader audience for poetry in Norway, because we thought that the poet as a genre was very exclusive. It was excluding and making literature too serious to people, because I'm a kind of opinion that very much literature can be funny but very deep, and very much literature can be very, very severe but not so deep. So I'm in a way a speaker for the humorist, the deep humorism in poetry. And my poets, I think, also reflects that I'm a kind of a humorist, but also a little anaphoristic. I'm also writing poems that can remind you about aphoristics also.
Yeah, so it's very interesting for me what you mentioned, the Stunt Poets group. So do you feel like that's maybe a new way of communicating with the audience or maybe a more attainable way of communicating with audience?
Yes, it was 30 years ago, but not today, I think. I think it's a kind of activism that suits for youngsters, for young poets. Nowadays, I think I'm more safe working on myself, but it doesn't mean that I'm less an activist, because I'm working with the political poems also with a group of people, but that it's in another way. It's in another way, you see.
Okay, thank you. So to continue, Sophie, I would maybe have something similar for you. So just to rephrase it, do you feel do you see yourself as more of a bandit or a stereotypical poetess when we're talking about these roles that Torgeir also mentioned? So how do you see the space for communicating with the audience about your work in writing?
Well, this changed in a way. When I started to do poetry, I just didn't care, and I did what I did, and people were always a little bit confused by what I did. But it was not so important for me. But the older I get, the more I have the feeling that it's also a political issue in a way, to reach other people, because we're all connected. If we want to change something in the world, if we have an impact, want to have an impact on the whole situation. And I think if you are a thinking and feeling artist, and then you have to think about the situation in the world, and you have to also try to make what happens transform in a way. The more I'm starting doing steps into the direction of the audience. It's maybe that started also because I teach a lot. I work a lot with children. Tonight I also teach again grown-ups after this nice encounter here. And I see also, if you want to reach other people, if you want to reach children, you also sometimes have to use forms that are maybe not so in a way sophisticated as I was always doing it when I was young. I still have the idea of doing something sophisticated and doing something special, because I think that's what poetry is. The definition till today in the Duden is that poetry is something that you don't know how it survived, because nobody can really understand it, and it was always only done for an extreme elite, but still it's the oldest form in literature after the ritual. So I think it's always, it has this thing of mystical touch, and not being able to reach everybody. It is in poetry in a way for me, but still I'm not so happy about it, and I try to make a compromise to. That's why I also started research. I write a book now about the best quotations in Grimm's fairy tales. Very simple forms that can be told every child before it goes to sleep. And I think the older I get, the more I also become in this way simple, like a child again. But this doesn't mean that I want to make a compromise in my literature. No?
Yeah. So would you say that there's maybe a bigger responsibility for you as a writer and as a poet, since you're working with children?
Yes, you got me. Not only with children, but through the teaching. Yes, I feel more than my own shit in my head. You know, that's yes.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you very much. So there's an impression that the poetry as a form, as the oldest form, like Sophie said, is much more convenient and attainable in the current society. So maybe the shorter forms are more meant to be for the current people and the readers. And it is often said people don't have the time or patience for longer literary forms. So actually my next question will be directed to Boris. Boris, do you feel that there is maybe a space opening for new engagement of poets, new social kind of engagement in the current society?
Well, regarding your question, I have always been engaged. Actually, this year I've celebrated 50 years of my first speech on the student demonstrations on the 15th of May, 1970. So I have a very long working stage as an activist, of course, as a poet in the first place. And of course, also a lot of conflicts, a lot of polemics, a lot of also dangerous situations. There were, of course, conflicts first with the former political system in the then Yugoslavia. Then it was followed by the very painful, tragic period of the Yugoslav wars, in which I organized humanitarian help for colleagues, writers, refugees, and especially for writers in the besieged city of Sarajevo, which I also visited during the war in the 90s. And unfortunately, these engagements were then also followed by several very sharp conflicts with the authorities of the democratic independent Slovenia. And regarding your question, bandit or a poet, I must inform you that my, I hope, joyful and peaceful image might be wrong because I was promoted to a murderer by the Prime Minister of Slovenia, Janez Janša, who is abusing the cover of the fight against the pandemic in order to seriously, radically close the society, politically also, to break the democratic rules. And because of my criticism of the political aspirations of his government, of his ties with the Hungarian President Orban and Poland, he has called me several times a murderer. Also because of my ancestors who were anti-fascist and anti-Nazi fighters.
Yeah, would you say maybe that the kind of engagement that you're talking about, the one that you had in the former Yugoslavia and actually after that, so would you maybe say that that's the thing that's been lacking in the broader circle of artists or writers or poets?
Relations between poetry and politics and ethic engagement can be very different, fortunately so. There are great poets who are not stained by politics at all. Mm. There are great poets and writers who are not engaged as citizens in any social conflicts and political struggles, but their literature is deeply ethically and also politically engaged. On the other hand, I know also cases of some colleague poets who write la poésie pure, as Valéry defined it, but who are in their personal life as citizens deeply engaged. So there can be very different positions and combinations between poetry and engagement. So we have to be careful here. What I spoke is my personal choice. And it is, to tell you the truth, also something which I'm, after 50 years of engagements, also fed up of. I would like to end with this kind of service to the society, but unfortunately, the situation again is so tense and dangerous, and so that I again felt a need to engage and to do what I can to prevent that our society, which up to now was quite liberal and normal, would fall into a kind of a dictatorship.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I hope that every one of us is sharing your perspective, especially on the anti-fascism as a point of view to a current situation in the whole world. So maybe to introduce one of the poetesses of the younger generation that also has a pretty clear stance on the thing that you were talking about right now. My next question will be directed to Ivana. So Ivana, everybody who ever read your work, your poems, and tracked what you're doing as as an editor, knows that you are very much engaged in the politically, let's say, as the broadest term possible. So can you maybe reflect on what Boris was actually talking, and maybe comment on the influence of contemporary authors when it comes to the broader society or its environment, social environment?
Yeah, actually what Boris mentioned, the situation is a kind of proof that the position of poet or any other citizen in any country can be either neutral or engaged. So everyone, I think, makes that choice, and it's not necessarily the question of poets or artists like an exception in the society, but also it's a matter of how far our voice can reach, or what we feel that we can change in our society. I believe that in Boris's case, since he was proclaimed a kind of enemy, or the least to say, that's also the proof that actually this kind of conflict that we can reflect in poetry or in our stance can be, for me, it's also something that is stimulating to write about, or to try to put this conflict into the text or into the poetry. Because I believe that there is too much violence in nowadays societies we cannot be blind to, and this is something that is intruding somehow in all spheres of our lives. So if I deal with poetry, it would be impossible for me not to admit or not to see this kind of violence and not to respond to it.
Yes, and maybe to pose the question that I had for Sophie in the beginning, do you feel that maybe the form of poetry is maybe more convenient for communicating about the topics that we're talking about with the broader audience, since the I don't know, digital space development and also its form, like, of poetry?
Yeah, definitely. The form of poetry nowadays, we can talk about a variety of forms, even performances or digital media opens up some special space for poetry. But of course, in the other sense, we can talk about this kind of plentitude or plethora of voices that cannot always reach the audience. So it is a kind of a democracy that we can feel in social media, or the way that everyone can express themselves in the way that they want. But of course, this can also be a positive and a negative side. I mean, it's not necessarily the real democracy that we can cherish in every moment, but it can be a tool depending on a situation. And since nowadays in bookstores, we cannot really find poetry books, at least in Serbia, it's very hard, and in libraries as well. So I think more and more people are somehow open to digital media and social media, and I don't know, some kind of digital books, ebooks as well.
Yeah, definitely. So just to go back to what was Boris talking about his engagement during the former Yugoslavia and the protests that were occurring in the state. I have one question for you, Anna. Since you are also next to your artistical engagement, you're also working as an anthropologist, a scientist. So I found one really interesting piece of your biography, that you were actually dealing with the transitional societies and post-socialist societies in the Eastern Europe. So yeah. It is often said that authors and artists had a much greater significance and public role in the communist and socialist societies, especially maybe in the Balkans and the Central Europe. So would you maybe care to reflect on the difference between social positions of artists in transitional societies nowadays, since we often hear that and we often feel like the artists are left behind nowadays?
Well, that is a huge question, but it's a very important question. And actually, as it happens, I will make reference to a very interesting book that I was reading with my students. I taught contemporary societies, a course in cultural anthropology at Exeter University at some point. And one of the most memorable debates I had with my students at the time was centered around the idea whether a particular era, a particular age, in order to gather momentum and define itself, needs a visionary figure at its center, and what that visionary figure would be. And if you look through history, you could see that, you know, the poets and the artists and you know, the religious figures, the philosophers too, the alchemists have always accomplished that role one way or another. The interesting shift in position is that in early, in early medieval times, let's say, all these visionary figures, the poets particularly, were aligned with the power. They were working alongside sustaining authority and sustaining power and wealth as well. And very often too, as we know through the Christian times, sustaining violence. That shift happened at some point. The breakage happened at some point along the way up to now, where the poets, the visionaries, have broken away with the power and came against it. They started to hate absolutism. This is what Boris was talking about, you know, being against dictatorship. As a poet, that's what you aspire to, however you do your poetry, whether it's political poetry, whether it's activist poetry or not. Something about it, when it's at its best, it will contribute to fighting absolutism. Now, the question in our contemporary society now, and where we are in time of coronavirus, of COVID, dark times, is what is the role of the, what can the poet do in lockdown? What can the poet do when the current situation, the state of isolation that we are in, it's only one that we can, how should I say, it's more visible because we all experience it around the world, but it's by no means the only form of darkness that we experienced as a world over the last 2 decades or so. Yeah, we must remember that we live in a world in which the far-right politics are sweeping the world from Trump America to Poland to Brexit in Britain to Hungary to India. As far as India, the authoritarian, populist, angry and defensive type of discourses that need to be counteracted somehow. Now, is the poet, the individual, the person capable of doing that? Of course not. Of course, it's not his job to do that. What the poet can do, though, is to help, well, at his or her best, is to help us see through the darkness, so we don't get completely overwhelmed and blinded by it and paralyzed. So that's I hope that answers your question. You were asking earlier on, I think Sophie, you were asking her why poetry? Why would poetry be the form that would speak to people more in these difficult times? And perhaps a possible answer I'll put forward to you is that it is the closest form that we have to prayer in a agnostic or a non-religious society that now we live in the West. Some of us, or most of us, let's say, we lost our faith. We don't know how to pray anymore. And poetry, or the metaphor, if you like, that is a powerful medium, is a powerful tool that both kind of points at realities as well as, and exposes them, as well as bypasses them on the same time. It's a very strong tool. And I think this is maybe poetry is, I would say, the form most able to deliver some form of light in this time.
Yes, if we continue in this manner, I think that we will conclude with the idea that every poet is a bandit. So actually, that's something that I
hope so.
Yeah. So you were talking about the isolation during the pandemic times, and it is often considered that the isolation is some sort of a natural state or working environment of a writer or of an artist. So yes. During the spring lockdown, you initiated one project that sort of deals with artistic production in the quarantine. So would you care to tell us something more about it?
Yes, actually, that came from a thought process that I was going through at the time, not dissimilar to what we're discussing here. I noticed at the beginning of the lockdown in Britain, which was mid-March, that a lot of people were reading suddenly a lot of poetry. I found myself, I always wrote poetry, but my main medium is the novel, is prose. I found myself writing poetry more seriously at that time. I also asked myself, how on earth does isolation look like in other parts of the world where, a city of 20,000, of 20 million, like Bombay, suddenly empty of people. I live in a small town in West Dorset in England by the sea. It's pleasant to be in isolation. In fact, you can walk through the streets of your town once a day, and you don't have to say hello and stop for a small chat with everybody. Actually, it's quite convenient. But of course, on the ocean is nearby. So, but of course, isolation will look very differently in other parts of the world. Half of India doesn't have access to, of children in India don't have access to electricity. They don't have access to computers. They can't carry on with their education. This is, a generation that will be lost educationally. So I wanted to ask, I thought, what would be the best equipped people to give me a short image of what isolation looks like from the place where they were. And of course, these were the poets. So I went about finding 100 poets from around the world. I ended up with 47 different nations and all continents. And together we wrote a collective poem on the common theme of isolation. It roughly follows the format of the Renga poem, which is a Japanese collective poem. Everybody follows what the people have done before them and try to continue it to the best of your ability. Clearly, each of us keeping to our personal style. And so we've accomplished that in, if I'm not wrong, it was mid-July that we finished it. We started it maybe mid-April, and we finished it in mid-July. It's been now published in Calder Journal and published in bilingual edition in Romania, in my translation too. And there's a film of the Renga as well, with all of the poets reciting their lines in front of an open window from the place of their isolation, a running metaphor of a window open towards a closed world, which you can also see online. And we also had 5 artists, also from around the world, invited to illustrate the poem, to respond to parts of the poem. So that's Airborne Particles.
Yeah, thank you very much. It sounds really interesting, and I hope that a lot of people will get a chance to see it online since it's available. So before we continue, I would just like to ask and tell everybody, to everybody that's been following us via Facebook Live or YouTube, you can also post your questions in the comments, and in the end we will have some time to read some of your questions and to give it to our participants. So that concludes my sequence of questions. I will now let Uroš continue.
Yes, thank you. Well, in this second part of the conversation, we would like to talk about the position of a poet in these challenging times of coronavirus pandemic. Quarantine has limited our physical movement and contacts, but thanks to technology such as the one we are using now, we are remain connected in a sense, perhaps more than ever before. How have things changed in the last year in the way poetry is written and presented? And what is the position of the poet in all of this? I would like to ask Cherry to share his thoughts on this. Cherry, it is known that you like to perform your poetry, and you also organize readings yourself. So can you tell us from your experience what has changed regarding the position of the poet recently? And is there anything positive in those changes?
Okay. I think, well, I can give my view very restricted in the Catalan area, which is what I know closer. And what I would say for so far, the main consequences of the pandemics and so on are, in this sense, from this point of view, are negative, I would say. And it's, I think, the poetry world maybe needs a little more time for reacting and for reorganizing and taking profit of all technologies. Of course, I have assisted and participated in many online events, and like B-Plan for more other live activities, mainly readings. But I think this element that you get in a live show, and I'm not saying show by chance, because that's another thing I would like to talk about. That's the point that at least here in Catalonia, in the Catalan countries, let's say, and mainly in Barcelona, poetry events are becoming more and more shows, and the performance and the reading is each time being more important, maybe than, not more important, but it's being a crucial part, more than the text itself, you know, that the reading your book. We have been talking before about isolation, I think, Joanna, and this the effect it produces to the poet. And I would also think about isolation in the reader. Reading is always an activity related to solitude and silence, normally. And this is, in terms of events, poetry events, I think changing. I think young generations prefer to be exposed to poetry in live events, and more than reading a lot. I don't think, I'm not sure that this change of paradigm is is having it's something negative itself, but I would say that reading should never be left apart. Of course, poetry books for me are a central part of the poetry phenomenon. The poets in Catalonia at least become every time more showmen and people who controls the timing and the scene elements and so on. So this in the technologies, in the social networks, when you put all these ingredients in the technologies, I think everything becomes reduced, and the possibilities are not cannot go so far. But I think imagination, creativity, and so on must be put here for thinking of formula useful for spreading poetry through the networks. Otherwise, the networks will be, as usual, as always, controlled by the main companies and the unique powers. And you know that video on demand networks like Netflix and so on are controlling the market and everything. So little things that are always the most interesting, and the ones who allow to happen something beautiful and different. These spaces for these little things have to be created somehow.
Yes, thank you, Cherry. I would like to ask Aida to hear her thoughts about this as well. In times of quarantine and isolation, we may have a stronger need for writing and expression. How has this situation affected you as a writer? Can you tell us maybe more about that?
Well, I have a daily job, so it's what quarantine brought me was much more time to write and read, which was really, I really liked my time in quarantine because I didn't have to go to the office. What I had to, I was able to finish my work without being surrounded by office colleagues. And this was really, I mean, I feel very privileged to live in a place which is, you know, I live in suburbs, so I can go into nature very easily. I have enough space, and I kind of didn't feel, I felt such a relief when the quarantine started. And that lasted for about a month. But then, and I had a feeling also that I'm much more socializing with people because I had Zoom, I could be on Facebook, we could talk on the phone. I think I talked to more people during quarantine than I usually talk in my everyday life. But then suddenly I started to miss this third dimension. You know, all of us are now these little boxes in 2 dimensions. So I don't see your bodies, we just see each other's heads. Some I see like half bodies. So it's nice to see you in your private spaces, in your working rooms, at your homes, but at the same time, it's kind of, you know, it's not real. It's a really kind of as if we entered some kind of science fiction story, and now we are living it. And those of us who do love science fiction, as I do, sometimes find all of this funny, but and exciting. But I have many friends who find it really depressing. So what I'm trying to do is try to comfort them, to tell them, well, it will all go away. So I don't know whether that answers your question. Yeah, I like that situation. Kind of gave me this permission that I don't have to go to town. I don't have to meet people. I don't need to participate in this or that event. I don't have to go to book launches or anything, which I mean, I'm not really going to that kind of events very often. Simply, I prefer small circles of people, few friends, talking to people on one-to-one basis. So I think for people as myself, maybe I should call myself introvert, this whole situation was kind of relief. On the other hand, I see that I need the outside world to kind of take me out of that position, because at a certain point you're not anymore sure, is this real life or not? Am I imagining you, or you are really there? You know, this old philosophical question, how many people are there in the world? Are we only maybe 15, but we are just moving so fast, so it seems that we are so many? Here with this reality, it becomes really kind of present, kind of real. I don't know what's waiting for us. I'm waiting for instance, I was thinking, I was so sorry that we couldn't go to physically, that we can't be physically in Belgrade at the festival. But then I was thinking maybe next year or in a few years, we'll be there as holograms, you know. Now we are just two-dimensional, and then we will project ourselves. And I like Star Trek, and I like, you know, Transporter, you know, when they just say energize, energize, and you are transported wherever. So I still sometimes hope that this will be an invention, that something like that will be invented so that I can still experience that. Right now, this is the closest that we came to that, to go on Zoom or Facebook or something like that. So I'm not sure whether I was more productive during that, when I had so much time. I think that may be an illusion, that when you don't have all these external pressure, that you are more productive. I guess we are all different in that regard. I'm not sure about myself. But I was thinking about that previous question, if I may add, about Bandit and the Poet.
Yes, sure. Mm-hmm.
Because I was thinking that, I mean, I have a long history as an activist back in the 90s, as anti-war activist and feminist activist. At the time, I still didn't come out as a poet. So that came later in my life, because I kind of tried to separate these two roles. I think Boris was talking about how complex is that relationship, that, you know, I was always afraid that of using poetry for political engagement, to put it into service of political engagement. Although I know that there are good examples of that. I mean, there are all kinds of examples of bad poetry and good politics, bad politics and good poetry. So we have all of that. But I think that every poet is a bandit in one particular way, not maybe in the sense regarding society. It is in the sense of the one who's trying more or less successfully to rob the language. That's what the poet does as a bandit, robbing the language for her own purposes, twisting it, transforming it, and then maybe sending it back. So that is what is particular. Like Joanna talked about visionary people and the role that the poet on occasion had. But I think that role of a visionary, of somebody who can move other people, who can mobilize other people, there are different how should I say that, functions in the society, not functions, there are different positions in the society, different roles from which people can do that. But then this is what is, I would say, specific for a poet, ability to do something with the language. That's what makes, that's what makes poet different. So we'll see what we'll do in pandemics with the language. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Aida. I would like to ask Nicola a question. Nicola, you have traveled a lot and you have participated in a lot of poetry festivals and events in Europe and around the world. I know that overcoming differences and crossing borders is something that is very important to you. How much does this situation allow us to do that? And how much, in your opinion and experience, the position of the poet has changed during these difficult times?
Thank you. Thank you all. It's a real pleasure to hear you and to talk to you. But at the moment, I'm in my hometown, Strumica. It's near Bulgarian and Greek borders. So borders were part of my life in a way. We're making fun that even if you go outside, you have take the passport with you because you never know which border you will run. And in a way, I was traveling for 20 years now, constantly traveling, and I was living this dynamic lockdown, locked in the plane, locked in a hotel room, locked in a reading room, and but at the moment, if someone asks me, okay, now describe your room when you are at the moment where you write, I will go outside and make photo of the window. Because it's kind of, I think this answer of escape, when we talk about bandit and poet, I think that what unites them is non-belonging. And once you feel the lockdown, it's imposed, that the solitude is imposed, then you don't name it solitude anymore. We all want to travel through the labyrinths of solitude, as Octavio Paz used to say, but even when we know that there's no exit, but if we know that it was not our choice to go inside, then we don't accept even when we know that to enter, even if we know that the door of other side is open. I think that we are at the moment like some electronic monks in cells, and we just sacralize our homes at the moment. Those precious, this precious space with objects from our trips. We all of a sudden, intouchable, run away from metaphysics. Now the intouchable is our reality. The distance became, I think, the opposite of longing. And I talk about this distance inside ourselves. All the terms changed in a way. That's why I think, as Darwish used to say, that sometimes space, and nowadays space is more powerful when it lives into language, in linguistics, than in geography. And we leave really the new maps of our emotions, of our presence, and the maps usually lie. They're made to lie, to think, to have this, when we sit on the wall, to think that everything is so close. That's what also Szymborska was used to say, that all maps give brings me, the map brings me world out of this world that doesn't belong to this world. And, but I have to admit that I enjoy being back to my hometown, because in that way, my childhood got space. It's not only now a time dimension. I don't talk about my childhood as it was in the past, like 10 years ago. No, I just go out and see the town as it is now, but through the filters of it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and always question myself as Cavafy used to say when he came back to Alexandria, he said, I don't know whether the city is changed or myself. And what I think is about this lockdown is it brings lots of changes, of course, inside us. And because in a way we are all living the collective absence at the moment.
Thank you, Nikola. I would like to ask Tadeusz a question about the festival. Tadeusz, you have also participated in many festivals, but you also participate in the organization of one. It's the European Poet of Freedom Festival, which is being held in Gdańsk. So can you tell us a bit more about the festival, and especially about the challenges it is facing in these circumstances?
Oh, the festival, it's my festival, can say my festival because I'm running it almost from the beginning. I've been the artistic director of the festival, responsible for the program. So it's very interesting event in Poland because the European Poet of Freedom, that's the name of the festival, European Poet of Freedom, sounds very proudly, but in fact, I hope that the poet is someone who extends our or stimulates our hunger for freedom. So we define freedom very, very wide. And the most recent edition of our festival was of course delayed, and we had only some kind of celebration when we gave the prize to the winner, and but most of the events were delayed. So it was for me as an organizer, it was kind of tragic circumstance, tragic situation for the first time in my life. Of course, something like that happened, and since the epidemic started, I think I'm not alone with this feeling. On one hand, I feel that nothing has changed. So we talk so much about virus, but we behave almost the same as previously. Of course, we try to keep the distance and so on, but the life goes on. But on the other hand, we are still living since almost 1 year under the pressure of the permanent fear. And this fear, I don't feel it's something that stimulates me for organizing, for writing, for doing creative things. Maybe in the future, I will be able to transform this kind of fear as a new adventure, as a new feeling in my life into something valuable, into some verses, into poetry. But now I feel a bit destroyed by the situation, and I don't think that this COVID situation helps to promote poetry or to make poetry or reading poetry more popular. I don't believe in it because people are too damaged, too destroyed mentally to absorb kind of some subtle messages from the artists. 99% of the of society in Poland is focused now on the local war between, I mean, in politics, between two fractions, the leftish one and a strongly right one. Yeah, we have this virus in the background. So I don't feel, it's my point of view, of course, but I don't feel it's a very helpful situation to believe or to let someone believe in poetry, or to help someone to start with poetry. The poet is no more someone very important in our society, of course, like I guess in most of the world today, and it will not change very soon, or even I don't expect it will change anytime. So we have to accept this situation that my festival and your festival, independently if it happens in reality or online, is a pleasure for 200-300 people infected by the virus of poetry.
Sorry, I cannot agree with that at all. I think it is quite a cynical view. It surprises me if it comes from a director of a poetry festival. Festivals are obviously not the privileged place for the real poetry, obviously. There isn't time and place for poetry as important as the crisis. Poetry functions the best in the moments of the peril, of the danger, because it is the quickest tool of language to articulate what we are all feeling. I'm absolutely sure that a lot of people are reading poetry. A lot of people are writing poetry. The role of a poet as a personality, of course, is not so important, but the role of poetry definitely is. If we think about the 9/11, the attack on Twin Towers in New York, the reading and writing of poetry increased enormously. And I'm sure that it is going on in this very moment. So I cannot accept this pessimistic view at all. Poetry, among other things, has a special capacity of reacting as quickly as possible and much faster than prose, drama, film, or other art channels.
Of course, reacting promptly means to have thousands of kitschy poems devoted to the crisis and COVID situation. It's the same like with the political writing, and poets who feel responsible to react for the current issues. I think the effect is thousands of volumes of kitschy poetry, which will be forgotten in a few next years.
If I may intervene with just a remark, which might maybe make your opposite sides speak to one another closer by. A few years ago, I was doing a research for one of my my novels, about human rights abuses in the Middle East. And of course, this took me to Guantanamo Bay sooner or later, and I came across an amazing text, a collection of poems written by the inmates of Guantanamo Bay, 48 of them, who took to poetry. Some of them were illiterate. They learned how to, they recorded some of the poems, and some of them wrote them down. They never wrote poetry before. They were going day after day through horrors that we don't come anywhere near in the crisis that we are in at the moment to even understand or compare. And this collection of poems was put together by the legal team of human rights who was representing some of these people, an organization called Reprieve. And I read these poems, and were they responding to a crisis? Were they responding to a personal crisis? Of course they were. They were about that. Were they kitsch? Were they not valuable? Were they by people who were poets before? That's not really even the question. The question is that the poetry in itself, that's what they reached for. This was the medium that they reached for at the height of their torment, at the height of their distress. And I recommend it to anyone if you ever find it. I don't think it has been published in a large number of copies, but it's poems from Guantanamo Bay, they're called. Poetry can be written, I think, and at its best also in moments of turmoil, I think. That's all I want to say.
Actually, if I may add, Joanna put it very nicely and gave excellent example. I would also say, okay, thousands and thousands of kitschy poetry, and nowadays it's more easy to spread them since we do have internet. So it was maybe more difficult earlier. But I would say all those who wrote kitschy poetry, who are writing kitschy poetry, they also very often are able to recognize good poetry. So they are also those who write because they need to write, because they need to express themselves. Those who find healing power in poetry very often do can recognize what's kitschy poetry and what's very good poetry, and can find also healing in reading poetry. So I would also be more optimistic and support this view that poetry in times like this, if it is still written, there is a power, there is a healing power in poetry, and I think it would be good to support it.
Can I say, yeah.
Who was talking?
Yeah, a couple of sentences from Norway. Yeah, I just like to say that I'm also think poetry is very important. But this in Norway now, we have what I call we are very stressed. I'm as a poet, and I'm also very political stressed and paralyzed, because we are living in the kind of shadow of Corona shadow. And that means in Norway nowadays we have a quite friendly and helpful right-wing government, but in the shadow of the Corona shadow, they are privatizing and centralizing and commercializing our society in a hurry that is not happened in Norway any times. So I'm very sorry for this situation, and it means that we also fight for poetry, okay, but we are fighting in the shadow of McDonald metaphors and McDonald culture. That is very difficult to get through, I think.
What I wanted to say was simply that I usually refuse thinking about poetry as a therapy. It can be natural, of course, a tool for whoever works with people that need to make a therapy and so on to express themselves. But as a poetics, I refuse this idea. But at the same time, I have to recognize that, yeah, it's also well known that crisis situations have been the seed for creating great works in literature history. So I'm not sure about whether one effect is more powerful than the other.
Could you elaborate more? I mean, when you say, I refuse to see poetry as therapy, because it can be seen as, you know, transformative power of poetry on individual and societal level. I'm interested, you know, when you say, I refuse, I can understand you don't want to write poetry as therapy. This is not your view, but what does that actually mean?
Yes, I meant a personal option and point of view of what poetry must be, or what my poetry must be. But also poetry in general. Of course, poetry can have many effects. And one of them can be, for example, if you are someday you're nervous or whatever, you can be get relaxed, or you're more comfortable or whatever by reading some poetry, by spending some hours in your shell, in your chair, in your favorite corner at home, but or wherever you used to read. But I think it's not. I don't think about poetry with this function, with this end as a pursuit.
Yeah. What
if I can add two sentences, I would say that the only way Corona helps us is it helps us to understand and to revise who we are, because we are under the pressure of fear, and we are alone, and we are and the communication, personal communication between people is over. Then we have opportunity to ask ourselves much more often than usual who we are and what is important for us, also in literature and in poetry. And maybe this way, poetry, also our poetry or our vision of poetry, can be deeper and better. But so I would say that this quarantine time helps more for us as a people in general as for the poets and poetry. So the Corona says, I'm checking you, who you are, and what are fundamental values, and what is really important for you. And yeah, and what to believe in, and so on and so on.
Tadeusz, don't you think that everything that you're describing, this state of self-scrutiny, being forced to look upon one's own self, isn't that conducive to poetry? Isn't that something that naturally would lead one to metaphor and to poetry in a way? You know, the combination of what Nicola was talking earlier on, having to stay put, having to stay still and really look at the place where you are, you know, really bring back the memory as well as the present and be in it, as well as being in your own self as a place that you are forced to stay with and contemplate at length and in depth. Both of these states together are very conducive of poetry, I would say. Whether it's a healing type of poetry, whether it has a cathartic sense to it, or whatever we want it to have, it doesn't, you know, the purpose of it, we all define it for ourselves in our different styles and poetical visions, but these two emerging states that come out from isolation, the staying put, the staying still, and the self-scrutiny, are connected to poetry. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, sure, but I'm afraid that statistically, 50% of people will get more self-conscious and more clever and more, I don't know, more and more something, but exactly the same 50% will get crazier and more stupid because of the situation. So we shouldn't idealize the influence of Corona. I would say that for some people it will help to understand something, and for the same number or even more people, it will be destroyable.
Nikolai, you wanted to say something, yeah?
Excuse me. Yeah. Can I speak? Yes.
Yes. Yes.
In a way, I really think sometimes that this kind of living on the edge of fear, in a way, we open ourselves. All our senses are more open. Usually, the flower opens mostly in the dark because it tries to absorb more light. In that way, I think the fear of death brings us in kind of life in fear, and we live with this. But as poets, I think we are constantly open, with or without this fear. We live the depth in kind of this. We live our own archaeology. So maybe that's why sometimes when this kind of crisis happen, people have more this need, at least at the beginning, to go deeper. I don't say deeper in themselves. So it showed very much, as Boris says, that after 9/11, people started reading poetry. Even we remember New Yorker at the cover appeared Adam Zagajewski's poem, Try to Price Mutilate World. Yeah, it was, as I remember. But what he said, I remember one debate in Brussels, he said, I didn't write this poem for 9/11. No, it was just on the table of the editor of New Yorker. And he said, well, it fits now. This is the poem that, so I think that's poetry. In a way, we recognize so many levels of our lives depending how open we are. And this fear sometimes opens us even too much. That's why we, as also Tadeusz said, people either go crazy or either they become calm. Like in Trier, melancholy, the only calm person before the end of the world was the person that was living with melancholy every moment. It was not anything strange, this collapse to her.
I would also like to add that the situation of crisis, if we are talking about Corona, doesn't necessarily mean that all poets or people who suddenly feel that they have some poetic impulse or stimulation will write about that. I think that the moment of crisis will crystallize some inner fears, some other types of problems within the society that do not necessarily have to do with coronavirus. Maybe people will not even mention the exact situation, or it doesn't have to be descriptive in that way, as I feel. But if we talk about the situation of crisis in general, whether Corona or some other personal crisis, it can definitely have the potential to crystallize and to bring about something through this medium of poetry or artistic, any kind of medium.
Thank you, Ivana. I just wanted to maybe add something for your debate that emerged, and that's really great. And thank you very much for that. So we have one question from the audience that actually continues to this discussion. I will now read it. Do you think that COVID-19 is changing our civilization forever? How will we live after pandemia? So it's not named, but whoever wants to maybe reflect on it.
So yes, I believe that it's going to change our civilization on a couple of years, that maybe, and it's going to change the economical balance in the world. I guess the East certainly, because the United States and Great Britain has treated the coronavirus so badly. And for us poets and for us small workers of art, I don't see any good perspectives for that. I'm very sorry, but I managed to write my poems, and I hope that during some time I'm going to establish a room for it, a three-dimensional room for it, because these very flat medias, I can't, I don't fix it.
Thank you very much, Torgeir. If someone else would like to maybe also say something about this, and also sorry I interrupted someone when I was reading the question. So since we have like 10 more minutes, so if you would like to say something else, just feel free to.
I think that something will change definitely. Some poets will die of hunger because there are no poetry readings and no festivals in reality. So the poets have no possibility to get money.
Yeah, I suppose that's a pretty correct statement. Okay, so anybody else? Nicola?
I think you have, oh, sorry.
Okay. No, it's okay.
I was with Tadeusz. We were in a writer's residency in Zug in Switzerland. And it was, I just add like this ironic comment I learned to add, because now we are in residency, but it's not paid. There's no fellowship. We are residents in our home. And we see, we don't recognize other objects. That's the most beautiful game that you play in these rooms. When you come, you try to find who left behind. And it's kind of beautiful language with the people that were here and the people that are coming by leaving your own objects in this room. Now, yeah.
Joanna, you wanted?
I was just wondering whether a possible answer to that question, if the world will look the same after the pandemic, is really, you know, if it doesn't look the same, then that's the optimistic view, that we've learned something, that we've experienced vulnerability and fear, and it transformed us psychologically. But I would take, almost against my nature, I would take the pessimist path this time and say that we will emerge from it, and we will go back to the supermarket and to the plastic uses and to the destroying of the planet and to the post-truth society, the way we were right before, and not look back one second. In fact, maybe even hungrier for all these things, even more entitled to all of these things. Am I too pessimistic? I don't know.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for this debate that spontaneously emerged. It was really, I think, the goal of my and Urosh's questions. So I think it really continued in the right way. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our discussion, and as we predicted, this was not enough time for all of you to say everything you wanted. I'm very sorry for having to finish up here, but I really hope that this started some new questions, and that people in the audience will have something to bring with them after we're finished. For everybody that is following us right now, just a quick reminder that at 9 p.m. we will have a poetry reading program. You will be able to hear some of the speakers at this panel So the participants will be Torgir Pedersen, Tadeusz Dombrovski, Sophie Reyer, Uroš Miloradović, Ivana Maksić, Chevi Pujol Molist, and Stasha Aras. And of course, I would like to invite you to be with us also tomorrow and to track our programs. To find it online, you can find the full program on Treći Trg website, as well as our social media pages. So tomorrow at 7 p.m., you will be able to watch the debate program on Leonard Cohen's poetry, called Leonard Cohen Poetry and Music. The participants will be Vladislav Bajac, Novica Petrovic, Damir Shodan, and the moderators will be Uroš, which is here with us tonight, and Dejan Matic. Probably it's important to note that the speaking language of the panel will be Serbian. Of course, tomorrow also at 9 p.m., the poetry reading program will present the poetry of Aida Bagić, Boris Novak, Masha Dabić, Agnes Lidbeck, and Georgi Ivkovic. So that will be all from us for this evening. Thank you once again, everybody. You were really great, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I really hope that we will get a chance to continue it in person, maybe in some different circumstances. Thank you very much, and be well.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. See you.
Have a good time.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
See you. Thanks.
Thank you.